All right, welcome. We are ready to build our very first web interaction. We're very excited to get started here. And what we're going to do is we're going to begin with a starter solution. So if you are working along, you're going to find a link in the video description. Just scroll down below and you can pause the video. You click on that link and you'll download a zip file. And if you go ahead and unzip that file, and that folder will have some sort of folder name after you unzip it that you can then go into your terminal and change into that directory. And within the terminal, you'll then be able to begin working on the solution that's going to be the exact snapshot that you're going to see me beginning with here in this lesson. So you kind of have two choices. You can either just watch and come back to reference later, or if you want to work along and kind of build things as I'm building them, you can start with that starter solution and kind of go through everything just like you're going to see me do in the recording. Once you have that folder unzipped and you've changed into it in your terminal, believe it or not, the folder is called Taco Spinner. We're going to be spinning some tacos today as a silly beginning intro web interaction we're going to be building. But the first thing you want to do once you've changed into that directory inside the terminal is just run an npm install. And that's going to install the dependencies that we need to be able to build and run a local dev server on this project, which is actually only two dependencies. It's a dependency called Parcel that we talked about briefly in the last lesson. And also, in our case, Parcel is using a Sass dependency that's going to bundle up our Sass files and transpile those into CSS files. So this only takes a moment. You'll see it's already done here. And now that we have done the npm install, I can run code space dot and then hit enter to open this up in Visual Studio Code. And we can now see the solution that we are working with. And you'll notice, first of all, that there's a bunch of config files here inside of the solution. Over in our sidebar, we have some stuff that's basically just setting up our build process. Then you honestly don't really need to worry about these too much. There's a README here in case you want to read a little bit about how you can get started and do all that good stuff. But for the most part, the only thing you really have to worry about in this starter solution that you've downloaded is this source or SRC folder. This is where all of the JavaScript, the Sass or CSS, and the HTML for our application that we're writing is going to be located. And chiefly, you have this index.html that sort of serves as the entry point for our Parcel solution that we are developing. And you'll see within this HTML file, we have some normal HTML, it's just setting up a document with a little bit of content in it. It is also linking in some style sheets, and they actually have the .scss or Sass file extension. And you'll see it's linking in, for example, this particular link is scss/app.scss, which sure enough, up here we have an SCSS folder, and here's our app.scss right here that just has a single style in it that we're styling something called a taco button. That's going to be fun. Just wait till you see that. But if we go back to our index.html, we keep looking at this. So there's our Sass file. The theme.sass is really just meant to give us some starter style so it's not totally ugly and we feel a little bit better about ourselves as we're developing this solution. So you can feel free to look around at all this other stuff I have in here that I've set up, but we don't need to change those in the lesson. So you can essentially just ignore the whole theme thing. But then otherwise in this HTML file, if you scroll down, we have a couple other HTML elements. The comments will kind of help you navigate. You can see we have a very simple nav bar here. We have a page area. And then finally, we have this button, which we're calling a taco button. And on Windows, you might see a little bit of a different icon there, but otherwise the differences are going to be pretty minimal. But you'll see we have this emoji or this little icon of a taco that's going to be inside of this button. And then finally, all the way at the bottom of our index.html file, we have this JS file, this JavaScript file that we are linking in called app.js. And sure enough, if we open the JS folder, you'll find app.js, which is an empty file to get started. So it's totally a blank slate. This is meant to be a very simple sort of HTML document or web application that we're going to build that's going to allow us to start out with some basic web interaction stuff that we can practice in this simple Parcel solution. And the cool thing is, back in our terminal, we can run npm run start, and that's going to start up a local dev server where we can test our changes very, very quickly. And here's our local dev server up and running. You will notice that we are running on localhost port 1234, which is the default configuration for our Parcel that is still running in the background in the terminal. So you'll notice here it says server running and it gives you that little link. As long as this terminal task is running, you're going to have this dev server that you can hit in your browser to actually see the changes that you make inside of your code editor, which is really nice. It's a local dev server. It's going to be very quick and easy for us to make changes and then see those changes show up inside of the browser here. I will also go ahead and open up our browser's developer tools because we are going to use those quite a bit. Let me make sure we increase the size of those a little bit so we can see that. But you'll see here we have our HTML that you just saw in index.html, and we can now kind of use the developer tools to inspect the different elements and the CSS styles and all of that good stuff that occurs inside of the browser developer tools. So we'll get into this a little bit more, but I'm just going to go ahead and open those for now so we can come back to that in a moment. But what I do want to show you is if we go back into Visual Studio Code here, now we can sort of do some coding on the right, and then we can switch back to the browser on the left and see our changes. And the coolest thing about Parcel and its local development server is if I change this to a burrito spinner and we change our emoji down here to a burrito like so, as soon as I hit save or I hit Command S on my keyboard, you'll see on the left, I didn't even have to refresh. It just updated it automatically. And that's the cool thing about this Parcel dev server that we have up and running is it's going to be super fast and easy. And the workflow is essentially make a change over here, see that change and test it on our browser on the left. And we're going to continue to do that in most of the lessons we do throughout the course. But you'll kind of want to get used to that process of you download the starter solution, you start up a local dev server, and then you make some changes and you can see those changes live inside of your browser. I'm going to go ahead and undo that because we are in fact making a taco spinner in this particular lesson, which sounds silly. And it is, but it's going to be fun. I think it's going to be more fun than a Hello World example because we'll actually get to spin some food, which might be strangely interesting. We'll see. But you'll see right now, this does absolutely nothing. It's just a button. I can click on it and it doesn't do anything. So our first order of business will be, okay, how do we start to implement web interactions? What is a web interaction? And how do we start to work with our JavaScript and our HTML and our CSS inside of this web application to eventually build up to doing some really advanced interactions, building common components like drop downs and modals and sliders or heroes or whatever you want to call it, and just all sorts of cool stuff that you could build and you'd expect to see in websites and web applications. We're going to kind of start out real basic and real slow, but we're very quickly going to ramp things up and we're going to start to build a lot more advanced components very quickly. But before we get there, I want to take a quick moment and just talk about something that is near and dear to my heart, and that is the DOM, or the Document Object Model. I think I would be remiss if I did not take a moment to talk about this because it's so integral to building web interactions, and it's so important whether you're a seasoned JavaScript developer or whether you are brand new and you really don't know much about JavaScript other than, hey, this is a variable, this is a loop, etc. No matter where you are on that spectrum, I think it's so important when you're building web interactions to at least have an awareness of this idea of the Document Object Model, or the DOM. And if you've never used that before, or even if you have used that before and you just want a bit of a refresher, if you will, it's basically what you're going to see inside of your browser's developer tools, right? It's this idea of this HTML document, this structured document that it has these elements in it. And as you can see here, this is just a screenshot from the developer tools in Chrome. But basically, each one of the elements here kind of represents a thing inside of the web application. And you can see that in the browser right now. I can hover over these elements over here on the right. And you can see, for example, I have an H1 with a class of brand. And that's actually, as I hover over it, you see it highlights this area at the top of our app. So in this case, the element is an H1 and it's representing this particular piece of content within our web application. And that's pretty simple, right? That's just HTML. It's nothing fancy, but it's so important to really focus on that, because if you think about your web application, that's basically what it all boils down to, is this idea of this document object model. And that document object model is essentially just the junction or the meeting of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And no matter what framework you're using, I don't care if you're using Bootstrap or Vue.js or React or whatever, it all basically just boils down to these three technologies. And that's kind of what this course is all about. It's kind of taking out all the extras and taking out all the icing on the cake that you could potentially have, and just coming back to basics and really trying to understand fundamentally, when you build a web interaction, what does it do? And ultimately, it all boils down to having HTML elements that are modified through CSS and JavaScript. That's really what the DOM is. That's what everything boils down to. Every time you use a menu or a dropdown or a modal or whatever, anytime you use any sort of fancy interaction inside of a web application, essentially it's just HTML elements being modified and adjusted and deleted and added or whatever. And it's being modified through CSS and JavaScript. And chiefly, the biggest technology, especially with web interaction, is going to be JavaScript. That's going to be the number one thing we're going to be writing quite a bit throughout this course, because that is the tool. That is the tool that we use in web applications to build interaction. Essentially, you're saying, when you click on this, then do this, or when you hover over this, then do this. And CSS definitely mixes in there quite a bit, and we'll be doing some CSS and some Sass throughout the course. But I think understanding this idea of beginning with HTML and then adding the CSS and JavaScript on top of it is really powerful. And again, even if you're somebody who's been doing this forever, I definitely had a point in my career where I had this aha moment where I'd been building web applications for years. And I was just like, yeah, you set the style.display to none and it disappears off the page. But I kind of had this aha moment, or this light bulb moment, where I realized it's all about the DOM. It's all about that document object model. And that's really what it all boils down to, is when you're doing stuff in the browser or in your web application, if you really think of things at that basic level of the DOM, you start to think, well, okay, we have this HTML element, and what can we do to it? How do we make it interactive? Or how do we do fancy things to it? Or how do we make it into this really complex component that I'm thinking of in my head? And what it boils down to is all of your HTML elements have these attributes or these things, this data that surrounds them, that we can modify through JavaScript and CSS. And that's the cool thing about building web applications, is it's actually a very simple pattern where you have these HTML elements and they can have things like some content in them. Maybe you have a button with some text in it, or it could have attributes. Maybe a link or an anchor tag has an href, and that controls, the destination when you click on it, where it goes. And you can have CSS classes that modify the style or the presentation of those HTML elements. You can have CSS styles that are added to elements, and that changes the presentation of those elements. You can have what are called DOM properties on an element that you chiefly interact through JavaScript. And just as an example, like when you're working with a form in JavaScript, an input has a .value property. That is a DOM or a document object model property on that element that only exists on an HTML input element. And there's a whole bunch of those that we're definitely going to look at throughout the course. But that's just another example of the sort of stuff that relates to the HTML element. You have events and listeners, which we're going to be using quite a bit. That's basically a way to say, when this happens, then do this. We're going to listen for a click, or listen for an input change, or listen for something, and then perform some interaction, which is really important when building web interactions. And then finally, you have relationships. And that's a really important part of this too, is that HTML is a hierarchy. And you have this HTML document, but if you pick out a particular element, a button is going to have a parent and it's going to have siblings and it could have children or child elements within it. And that relationship is really important to understand too, is that the DOM is basically this big tree structure or this hierarchy of HTML elements, and every element in the DOM has all of these things attached to it. And essentially building a web interaction is modifying one of the things that you see here. So it is modifying the text content or changing the attributes on an HTML element or applying CSS classes to change the presentation on an element when something occurs. It is changing the CSS style or the DOM properties on an element to adjust its behavior. It's listening to events or even using the relationships of an element to traverse the DOM, to move around and, say when you click on this button, go find its target and then do something to that. A very simple example of that is a drop-down menu. And this is what web interaction is all about. I can't stress enough that just being comfortable with this idea of the document object model and being comfortable with making changes to these HTML elements is basically all we're going to do in this whole course, right? We're going to interact with HTML elements. We're going to do this. And I'm really simplifying that because there's a lot of nuance to it, but I think it's really good to kind of think about that because it makes it more accessible. Instead of in your head thinking, oh, I have to create this crazy component that's going to do all these different things. It's going to have drag and drop and it's going to have all these listeners to have this complex behavior. If you kind of boil it down to just, oh, well, it's just HTML elements and there's these few things that I can do with them, that makes it more accessible. It makes it seem more attainable. And that's kind of why I point this out, first of all, is it's just that's essentially what we're doing. That's the most important thing to kind of wrap your head around for this course. And also that's why it's so essential to be comfortable with your developer tools whenever you're building these applications as well. Because just like you saw in that previous slide, we have our HTML elements. We have our text content within the elements. We have our CSS classes and our CSS styles. All the CSS styles are listed here, or over here in the computed pane over here, that allow you to modify how this element appears. Similarly, you may have never used this, but you can dig into event listeners and the DOM properties. So on an HTML element, for example, you could have, for example, the children of that element or the class list, which is going to give you all the classes on that. And these dev tools give you access to see all of this stuff that I mentioned right here. Right? And that's why those developer tools are so essential in building your own HTML web interactions from scratch. Because again, this is what everything right here, all these tabs that have to do with a single HTML element in the DOM, this is what we're manipulating to build web interactions. And if you can kind of understand how to do this stuff and get down a few basic patterns in terms of dealing with these HTML elements, you're going to be in really good shape when you go to build your own web interactions. And it's going to unlock the ability not just to create some common patterns that a lot of people have basically already solved. So what I mean by that is like when you go to add a drop down or you go to add a menu button or a toggle button or something that is in a lot of other applications, it's pretty easy to get that code, right? You go copy and paste it from somewhere else, or you import a library into your web application and you're good to go. You don't really have to think about how it works. But if you understand how it works at a basic level, how to manipulate the DOM on your HTML elements, whenever some complex pattern gets landed in your lap and somebody says, hey, I want you to build this dropdown, but it needs to do this, some crazy extra feature that those libraries don't support, you're going to be able to do it because you know how this actually works under the hood. And that's what this course is all about. That's what we're going to be doing throughout the course, is we're really going to do sort of a deep dive into this idea of web interactions and building interactive components in your web applications from scratch. And eventually we'll get a little more advanced and we'll get to implementing this into some state management frameworks, things like React and Vue.js and those awesome libraries that are absolutely, they have a use and they're absolutely awesome to do this sort of thing. But they're sort of abstracting the DOM when you use those things. It's sort of abstracting this idea of interacting directly with your HTML elements and editing that stuff. And so we want to dig in and really get into the nitty gritty of this, and then we'll add that stuff on later. And you'll see how that makes things easier as we get into some more advanced uses of these components. So that's enough of me blabbing about the greatness of the DOM. So let's go ahead and get started. We'll actually start building our very first web interaction now that we kind of understand this idea of interacting with HTML elements and the DOM itself. So as I mentioned, we're going to start out pretty basic. And in order to do this, I want to kind of get down a few patterns early on in the course, things that we're going to use over and over throughout the rest of the interactions that we build later on. They're going to add complexity and add more and more complexity as we get further. But I want to start with a few very common patterns that we're going to use in all of our interactions. And then once we have those down, we can kind of start to add some complexity to it and do some interesting things. So as you can see here, this application is called Taco Spinner. Believe it or not, we're going to spin the taco inside of this button here eventually. And what we want to do is we basically want to create a what I think is probably the most basic web interaction is this idea of what we could call a switch. So you click on the button and it switches on. You click on the button again and it switches off. So we're not even dealing with multiple HTML elements at this point. It's just a single HTML element that's going to be active or inactive. And we're going to use our JavaScript to create this very first interaction. But in order to do that, we need to understand the idea of selection in JavaScript. And when I say selection, what I really mean is basically how in JavaScript do we make sure that we can select the correct HTML element out of the DOM or the document object model to make sure that when we make changes to our HTML elements, we're changing the right element. So we're always going to start by kind of looking at our document object model here and looking first of all at the element we want to change. So in this case, we have this HTML button or this button tag, and it is actually the thing that we want to be able to click and sort of manipulate to create this switch interaction. And so you'll see it has this button ID equals taco-btn or taco button. So when we talk about selection, the easiest and the first thing to do is in our JavaScript file, we could very simply say get the taco button, and we could say const taco button equals document.get element by ID, and then you pass it whatever ID that you want to get. So in this case, it's taco-btn. And this is called selection. This is a way that we are selecting an element out of the DOM. Out of all the HTML elements that are in this page, we are singling out this single button with an ID of taco button. And in HTML, as you likely know, IDs are unique selectors, so there can be no other element in the page with this same ID or this same identifier. And that means that we can select a reference to that button in our JavaScript using this document.getElementById method. And then if we simply do a console.log taco button right down here, you'll notice that when we save, if we look in our console down here in the dev tools, you'll notice that it went ahead and logged and said, hey, you now have a reference to this button. And that's important because, again, this is it's very basic, and you may have done this before if you've done JavaScript before, but that is important because once you have a reference to an element in your JavaScript, you can start to do stuff to it. So I could say taco button.style.display equals none, for example, if I wanted to hide this for some reason. And you'll see as soon as I save, that button's going to disappear because what I did behind the scenes, you'll notice here, is again, I modified its DOM value. So in this case, I modified its CSS styles. You'll notice it added display none, or it added an inline style to that element that is controlling its visibility. And I can sort of check that and uncheck it to see the effect that display none has on that element. So that's a very basic thing you could do with your references to HTML elements that you've selected, is you can modify its style properties, and there's a whole bunch of those. You can see in the autocomplete just how many of those there are, and it's basically any CSS property you can think of. You can modify that directly. You could also do things like taco button.inner HTML equals, and then let's change it to a burrito. So again, we're getting a reference to that, and we're changing a property on it called inner HTML. and we're going to change that to actually be a burrito, which is going to update the HTML on the left. So just another example of how we can manipulate the properties of the DOM properties of this element that we have selected. There's also one I think called text content. I don't know if that works with an emoji. Yes, it does. Hey, look at that. So we updated the text content, which is the same thing. You just can't use HTML tags with text content because it'll just treat that as regular text. And just all sorts of stuff. So if you have Visual Studio Code, the cool thing is you get this nice autocomplete. You can sort of click through here and look at all this stuff you can do. There's lots of methods and stuff with it, but that's also what your dev tools are for too, right? You have these properties over here, and you can see this particular element has all the properties of not just an HTML element, which has certain properties, but there's also specific ones for an HTML button element. So for example, a button can be disabled. So there's actually a disabled property on here because it is a button. So for example, I could say taco button.disabled equals true. And if we save that, I don't think I have any styles to indicate it's disabled, but you'll see in the DOM over here in our dev tools, it actually added the disabled attribute. And now if I click on it, it doesn't actually do anything, where previously it kind of had that little animation and you can outline it. I have now disabled this button from being clicked. And there's multiple ways to select elements inside of your HTML. And that's an important thing to consider too, because you may be building an application where you don't necessarily have a unique identifier or a unique ID for the element that you actually want to manipulate. So in this case, we could change our taco button reference up here. We could change the way we can select that element by using some other aspect of that element's HTML. So for example, I could simply, because this is a button element, I could simply say document.querySelector button. And what a query selector does is it's kind of like a CSS selector. So if you've ever done CSS, it's very similar. How you can select things by their, .class. If they have a class, you could do that. I could do taco-btn, and that's the same thing as getting it by ID, because the number sign is an ID selector in CSS. I could also just select it by its element name, and the query selector is going to get the first matching element. So it's going to go to the document, which is the whole page, and then it's going to run this query selector, and it's basically going to search all of these elements in the whole document until it finds an element that matches this selector. So if I were to, again, console log taco button, just like we did before, using this query selector, I'm still going to get a reference to that. And if we clear console and refresh just to make sure that that works, you can see, sure enough, I'm still getting a reference to that button. Now, what's interesting about that is if there were two buttons here, so if I were to duplicate this and we were to create a burrito button down here, burrito button, and then of course we need to change this to burrito, and then let's add our burrito right here. And we hit save, you'll see it adds a burrito button down there. When we run the code, if I refresh here, you'll see the reference to our taco button is only the first button because it is, again, the first element that matches the selector that we passed into this query selector method right here. So it's only finding the first one that we actually want to do. Let's add a couple styles so this burrito button doesn't look so lonely here. Let's create a burrito button style, and and actually I could just do comma burrito button up here, and that's going to style both of them to be really big buttons. But then down here we'll do burrito button, and we'll add a different background color to it. And then let me just put in a color so I can use the color palette thing, and we'll pick kind of a, I don't know, what color should a burrito be? I have no idea. Burrito buttons, this looks good. And let me change that to a hex value there. So we'll give that a little save, and you'll see we now have a couple different buttons. Over here, we have a burrito button and a taco button. They both still do nothing when you click on them, but we've actually added those. We should probably also add plus button margin top 15 pixels or something, just a little bit of a space between them. That looks good. So now we have two separate buttons here. But again, that selector over here is only selecting the first one that it finds, which could potentially be an issue because if somebody comes in maybe later and they say, you know what, our burrito button actually shows up first, well, suddenly our selector, even though we called this taco button, well, it's actually referencing, as you see the highlight, when I hover over this, it's actually referencing the burrito button in this case because our HTML changed. I'm going to change that back because we don't actually want to do that. But just something to keep in mind when you're using query selector to do selection in your JavaScript. But if you're in a situation like this, what you could do is you could do query selector all. And that actually returns not a single element, but if we were to console and log whatever this returns, if I save here, you'll see it returns what is called a node list. And this is kind of like an array. It's not quite an array if you've used arrays in JavaScript, but it is very much like an array and has a lot of the same prototype methods as an array. You can see here it has like for each and dot length and a lot of that same stuff you would get with an array. But just as an example, if we wanted to get all the buttons and like do something to each of them, you would have to do what's called an iterator. So iterate over all buttons. And so we should probably change this variable name to buttons. And then we can say buttons.for each button. And then we could use an arrow function to say console.log button, like so. And now if we clear our console and do a refresh, we make the console a little bit bigger here, you'll see it's actually logging 2 of those. So it's doing an iterator to actually go through each button that it finds in this query selector all method. So this is how you would kind of loop over many different things that you're selecting in your document. And then, of course, you could manipulate each one. So, we could say for each one, let's set button.enter HTML equal to, and then we could do some sort of emoji. Ooh, pizza. That sounds good. I'm getting hungry. How about you guys? So now we've created 2 pizza buttons inside of our code here. So these are all silly examples. It's certainly not a real application that you would want to build, but I'm just sort of showing you different ways that you can do that pattern of selection inside of your application. And it's going to differ based on what you're doing. You may have, in some cases, dynamic content that doesn't have IDs. You may be able to manipulate the HTML so you always have IDs. And it's just kind of up to you to decide as a developer when you need to use these different methods, but you do need to kind of understand and put into your developer's tool belt, if you will, this idea of, okay, I can do selection in this, a number of ways. I can select by ID, I can select via query selector, I can select using a query selector all, and then iterate over all the things that I get back to do something to each one. And it's going to be different in every situation depending on what you actually want to do there. So what we'll actually do here is I'm going to go back to a simple example, just do a couple undos here. And we'll go back to when we had just the select by ID or use that get element by ID. And let's actually do what we mentioned in the very beginning, in that we want to create an idea of a switch. So we want to say, when you click on this taco button, then do this. And we can do that using a button click listener. So basically what we'll do is we'll say taco button dot add event listener. And this is really essential in building your own web interactions, is understanding this idea of event listeners, because that's basically what interaction is when you're building a web interaction in your own web application, you're basically saying, when the user does this, then I want to do this. So when you click on the drop-down button, open the drop-down menu, or when you click on the menu, pop out the options, or whatever it is that you want to do, you need to use these event listeners to actually control that, hey, when the user does this, then I want to do this. And in this case, the first argument you'll see here in the IntelliSense or the autocomplete, it takes a listener type, and then it takes a listener function itself. So you can actually see in the autocomplete, there's a whole bunch of listeners you could potentially use, like just a ton. And we're going to use a lot of these later on in the series for sure. But for the most part, your most basic event listeners are probably, and most of the time you're just going to use click. That's the most common listener that you'll do, is say, when you click the button, then let's do this. And the second argument is the listener itself, which is a function. And so we could take that function and use an arrow function to basically say console.log button clicked, like so. And so now, because we have selected an element up here and we've added an event listener to it, you'll actually notice here when we clear our console, if I were to click on the taco button, it says button clicked. And if I click on the burrito button, it still doesn't do anything. Because again, I've only manipulated the taco button HTML element in this case. And not only that, but you'll notice if we look at our taco button, we have it selected here in the dev tools. If you switch to the event listeners tab, you'll see, hey, there's our event listener that we added. We have a click listener on this particular method, and it has a handler and has all these properties on it that you could potentially use in your script. But you don't really have to worry about that, but you can kind of see how it shows up. This is again, we're just manipulating the DOM by adding an event listener to this button, which is going to do something every time we click on it. So you see it just keeps logging 20 times button clicked. And in this case, what I actually want to do is not log button clicked to the console, but rather let's manipulate our selected element, or our taco button in this case. Let's actually manipulate it so that we can create that idea of a switch. Again, we're going to click on the button, it's going to switch on. We're going to click on it again, it's going to switch off. So in order to do that, a very simple way to do a switch in your web applications is to use the classes. And this is very commonly what I like to do when I'm creating a toggle or a switch or any sort of functionality where things turn on and off, is you basically can manipulate the classes. So when the switch is on, you could have like a class that shows up here, and when it's off, that class disappears. And then that way in your style sheet, you can kind of control what this element looks like when it has the class and when it doesn't. But then your JavaScript, all it has to worry about is adding the class or removing it, which is pretty cool. So what we could do in this case is we could, again, this is called taco spinner. So maybe we'll just, when you click on the button, we'll add class equals spin to the button itself. And that's pretty easy to do. What I can do is say taco button dot class list, which is what's called a DOM token list. And it's basically a list of all the classes, again, kind of like an array that you have on that HTML element, but it has some nice methods on here that you can see, these little purple boxes. I can do, for example, class.add. And so if I want to add a class called spin, I just do it just like so. tacobutton.classlist.add, and that's inside of an event listener. So you'll see what happens now if you watch this element up here. Let me shrink this down a bit. Watch this button element right here where it says info. As soon as I click on the button, you'll see it adds spin. So we've done that on the event listener. And now what's really cool about that is in our Sass file. So for example, over here in our Sass file, we can basically create a spin animation so that we can kind of spin an element whenever it has that spin class on it. And so what we'll do here is we'll say spin that taco, and then we'll say when you have, well, you'll notice first of all that the button has a span inside of it. And the reason I did that is because, well, let me show you first. I'll show you the reason why we don't want to get crazy with this. So first of all, let's go down to the bottom and we'll create a spin animation. So we're going to use that using CSS keyframes. And these are pretty easy to do. We're basically going to go 0% transform rotate 0 degrees, and then 100% transform rotate 360 degrees. So that's going to be our animation. Did I not do something right? Oh, keyframe. I need to give it a name. Keyframes spin. There we go. So now we've created this animation called spin, and it's going to go from 0 degree rotation to 360 degrees. So it's going to spin all the way around. And what I could do now is I could go and say, okay, whenever you have dot spin on this element, and in Sass, you can do the ampersand, which refers to whichever element selected up here. So when the taco button has a class of spin, then we set animation spin, I don't know, 2 seconds, linear, infinite. So we're going to do like an infinite animation, so it'll just keep spinning. But what's interesting is you don't want to do that on the button itself, right? Because then the whole button is spinning. So the reason why I added this span inside of that is so we could just spin the span with a class of taco whenever our button has a spin. So we'll just add .taco around this CSS thing. And unfortunately, the taco is not going to spin because you can't do a transform, which is what our animation is doing down here. You can't do a transform on an inline element. So we also need to set display inline block on that taco element. And finally, when you do that, you'll see our taco is spinning around, which is pretty cool. And if I refresh the page, it's not spinning. And when I click on the button, we are spinning that taco. How cool is that? I need that taco to spin way faster. We'll do like 0.2 seconds, 0.1 seconds. Oh yeah, that's looking good. This is so weird, isn't it? But it's fun, strangely fun to spin tacos. I don't know why. Maybe that's just me. But we're not really building out this idea of a switch just yet. Because right now you can only turn the switch on. You have to refresh the page to get it to go off. So another thing we can do is inside of our JavaScript, we can say classlist.toggle. That's a really handy little method they have. So it'll just toggle this spin class on and off. And now we have a proper switch. We have built our very first web interaction, and it was just that easy. Again, we used that idea of selection, and then we manipulated the selected HTML elements DOM properties to add an event listener and to change its class list DOM token list property. Its DOM property, which adjusts the presence of this spin class that you see right here. And then in our CSS, we are adding the spin animation to actually make a presentation change. So the cool thing about this, and I think the reason why this is a good pattern, is because we have our JavaScript, which doesn't really have anything to do with presentation, right? All it's doing is saying, here's an event listener, and then toggle a class on and off. It doesn't care about what that class does. That is the purview of our Sass file or our CSS file. The CSS is controlling the presentation based on the presence of a class. And I think that's a powerful pattern. That's a really good pattern to utilize because you don't really have to worry about presentation in your JavaScript, which JavaScript shouldn't worry about presentation because it's focused on interactivity. And then the presentation can be controlled inside of your style sheet entirely. And then, of course, in your HTML, it's only concerned with content and structure. And so in this case, again, it doesn't have anything to do with spinning or the animation or the presentation of this. It only cares that there's two buttons on the page. Right now, the burrito button does nothing, and the taco button is going to turn that spin on and off, strangely enough. But so hopefully you enjoyed building your very first web interaction. In the upcoming lessons, we're going to start to look at this, start to understand how we can wire this up with additional buttons, how we can use some best practices and better patterns to improve this even further. And we're going to apply those patterns to a lot of the future interactions that we build throughout the rest of the course.